Yeah, hi everyone. Welcome to the Digital Experience Communities webinar. We are a vendor agnostic free community to join. So join our Slack, use the QR code. Today, we have experts in the industry talking about CMS, where CMS is going, the direction of content management systems, and we might even get a little back and forth on headless and traditional and what that means to all of us. Before we get into that, though, Mark, could you give us an explanation of race to the middle and what we're going to talk about?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting and might even be a contentious topic because not all of us even agree on whether this dichotomy is a thing. But a lot of folks, looking at content management, kind of think of content management in two camps: those CMSs that are page-based and sort of layout focused, and those CMSs that are more focused on structured content and often termed headless in that respect. But of course, these lines are blurring a lot, and the functions between those two, previously thought of as separate and distinct camps, are also blurring a lot as well. And so there's not a lot of consensus, and I expect there might not be even from this conversation. And so with that, I'll kick it off and let's get into it.
Awesome. Before we go ahead, though, we're trying to help Greg here. Greg, do you want to take a couple of minutes, tell us about your book and your fundraising effort?
Yeah, so I'm working on, a couple of years ago, started writing this book about designing content authoring experiences for CMSs, and I had a publisher and the deal fell apart. And so now I'm fundraising to self-publish the book. I'm running a Kickstarter. It's really targeted for all of the people who are involved in building CMS implementations, but also broadly trying to get, content strategists and content designers and UX designers involved in the process as well, because I think they've got a lot of value to add to the process, and they're very often left out of it. And it's got a lot of examples and a lot of process stuff that I've been working on. And it's on Kickstarter. It's got 2 weeks left. I'm 51% funded so far. And so I would love if people would take a look at it, and if they're interested, help me make it happen.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg. I hope you get to the goal. All right. To kick it off, what we're going to do is, can each of you, and I'm going to go through my squares. So can each of you introduce yourself, and then could you also share your view on the current and future direction of CMS and where you think it's going? So I'll start with Jeff.
Oh, no pressure. My name is Jeff Eaton. I've been doing web and content management work for probably about the last 25 years or so. And I'm a partner at Autogram. We're an agency that helps organizations solve complex content and design systems and operations problems. Boy, what do I think about this this dichotomy in the direction it's going? I think there has been a strong artificial distinction made between headless and traditional or full stack content management tools for a long time. The vast majority of the differences between the two camps are about software architecture, not necessarily fundamental philosophy for the content itself and how it's managed. That's not to say that they're equivalent. There are different systems have very different ways of approaching structural concerns, but I think that the emphasis on tool choice and software architecture has often been conflated with the fundamental philosophical approach a tool takes to the content. And I think that as both of those categories sort of get their footing and, move forward and understand their own differences with their competition, more conversations are coming back to the distinction in philosophical approaches to content. And I think that's healthy.
Thanks, Jeff. Mark, you want to go next?
Sure. So Mark Demany, and I'm a senior director of product management here at Yext, and we are really a content management company, but focusing on content management really specific related to locations and digital presence. And so it's a lot of big brands, usually with a lot of bricks and mortar operations. So it's a very specialized task, and it's very interesting. I just joined here pretty recently, and it kind of underscores to me the wide variety of content management types within the ecosystem. And you sort of often get this question like, why are there so many different CMSs and WordPress and Drupal and AM and Sitecore and headless vendors and all of this, and it really is down to like a lot of different CMSs do different tasks better in different ways. And so that's kind of continually fascinating to me, unlike databases or CRMs, which tend to have converged over time. To piggyback off Jeff's point, I think a lot of the core fundamental things around content management, and he uses that word philosophy, and I use that as well a lot, hasn't changed. You still need to think about content strategy in the same way. You still need to think about content reuse in the same way. I think a lot of people struggle with that though, and struggle with content management as a practice. And so I think one of the interesting things with headless vendors coming along is, to Jeff's point, there was architectural distinctions there as well. But I think one of the really nice side benefits of that was that headless systems made you think about content strategy and structuring content upfront. Like without that core task, you couldn't do anything. A lot of older CMSs, you could muddle by with a really horrible content architecture and sort of still get up and running. So that burden of understanding those core tasks and the philosophies was shifted up front, which I think was interesting and useful. But I also agree, the underlying tools and those approaches are kind of blurring, but it does underscore that there, I think, is a gap between practitioners and overall understanding and what vendors are doing, and vendors are trying to close that gap, but it's still often up to education to fill that.
Michael, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Michael Andrews, and I am an independent content architect. A lot of my recent experience has been with headless CMSs, so I bring a lot of that perspective to how I see things evolving. And I, like a lot of people, am less interested in the IT architectural distinctions among CMSs, but I am very interested in the philosophical differences among CMS approaches. And I'm interested because I think we're sort of at a stage now where we need content to do so many things in so many different ways, and we need to connect this content to so many applications across enterprises and be able to integrate things and be able to allow content to be expressed in so many different ways. And so I think what we've been trying to figure out as a industry and as a profession is how we jump away from this sort of containerized approach to looking at managing content, the page as being the defining container for content. And there's a huge shift in thinking. People who are content strategists like I've been will still have trouble with that, even though they're sort of maybe feels, in an abstract way, they're on board with it, but they still have a hard time sort of understanding how do you make that happen in practice. And I think often the tools haven't enabled it as well as they could. So I think there's still a lot of usability issues and tools that need to be overcome. And there's a lot of gaps in things that should be in place to make it possible to do this. So I think there's a lot of struggle right now. I think there's some stagnation even, that people are kind of giving up on dealing with some of the bigger problems and just trying to focus on smaller ones. And that's where I see things now.
Thanks, Michael. Greg, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I think I tend to have a similar approach to what Eaton says, that these are largely technological and architectural decisions. And even, Mark mentions that Headless forces you to think about structure up front. But yet I've heard from many people I know who work at Headless vendors complaining that people are just building essentially WordPress in their Headless CMSs, and like to me, I understand in principle how that's true, but what this all really comes down to is organizational maturity and how you approach your content and your marketing plan, the direction of your organization, because a lot of the things that Headless enables, in theory, like most organizations aren't even put in place to enable. And so I do think that there is a lot less of a difference between traditional and Headless on the ground than there might appear to be, or that the marketing departments at Headless vendors might wish there was. But I think that overall, this to me is really just like technical architecture. What are your preferences? What works best for your workflow? And a lot of this just comes down to what organizations are prepared to do.
Thank you. Roel, do you want to go?
Yeah, of course. My name is Roel Kuik. I work at Aviva Solutions. I've been there for the last 7 years. We're a digital agency that covers both DXPs, Headless, and custom development on CMS challenges. The thing for me is, it's great that we have an abundance of choice now between different CMSs, right? It's a big advantage of the way it's been in the past. But it's also at the same time creates a risk. What am I going to choose? And what we see a lot with our clients is that they kind of get caught up in the marketing noise and have a preference for either a specific DXP or Headless or whatever, just because that's the thing they heard of most, without being checked on what is it that they would actually need or benefit from the most. And that's concerning as far as we're concerned, because it sometimes feels like it's, from a vendor perspective, it feels like it's more about market share and revenue and all that kind of stuff, instead of trying to focus on, are we actually delivering something that's best for customer A, B, C, or whatever. And hopefully things will settle down more in the future, and we'll have the market will have a more clear understanding of what's out there and what works for them best.
Thank you. All right. So we have a few questions. Hopefully some of you can dive into them. I know Mark started off by giving what his definition of race to the middle is. I'm wondering if one of you can jump in. And what does race to the middle mean to you? It seems to be like a very contentious term, because it depends on who you talk to. And if you talk to a few people, they take it as an offense. And if you talk to someone else, they're like, yeah, we're all trying to get to the same place. So who wants to jump in and give your, go ahead.
I'll dive in. I think the negative implication of that phrase is like, oh, everything's just becoming homogenized. But I think what we're seeing is like Headless, the whole Headless content ecosystem really grew out of the idea that there's this sort of semi-trailer of functionality for building web pages and publishing web pages that's sort of being dragged along behind legacy CMSs, and making critical decisions and customizing things to your needs, and doing the content stuff you need to do in order to manage and publish your content as like core assets for your business. That's dead weight for a lot of organizations that need to do custom stuff, and you're better off starting with this light core framework that turns your content into an API. And on the flip side, a lot of traditional vendors have been saying like, somebody's got to make web pages out of this stuff eventually, or somebody's got to turn it into ebooks or newsletters or whatever. That work happens somewhere. Either you do integrations or you write it from scratch or whatever. We've been doing that part for decades, trust us with it. And I think increasingly traditional full stack CMS vendors have recognized that there is a great deal of value to their customers in being able to tease more and more of the content itself apart from those broader structures that are being produced and published, so that, and there's a lot of different pressures driving that, but like the idea that we've made a piece of content and it may need to take a bunch of different forms or be used in a bunch of different ways. More traditional CMS vendors are understanding the value that brings to customers and are adding capabilities or reworking capabilities so that you can use an API to expose your underlying content to other tools or things like that. And on the flip side, more and more headless vendors, as they've reached a sort of maturity point in that pure API approach, have now started having to tackle those complex publishing and management tasks that were historically the domain of those traditional vendors. Like, oh, that's great, we've got these free-floating atoms of content now, but we actually need to put these together into a landing page, or we actually need to assemble them into our newsletter. What's that look like beyond just editing the case study thing in the headless CMS? So I think that idea of the race to the middle is like both of them recognizing fundamental value in the stuff that the other camp really specialized in and beginning to tackle that stuff. So what you're seeing is, there's a deep divide in the terminology and the ecosystem divisions, but there's more and more work on each side trying to get to a functional point where they can do the stuff that's been thought of as the domain of the other side. Like, headless CMS vendors making live preview page building tools, and, WordPress is doing like RESTful APIs so you can, republish your content in a bunch of places. There's a lot of crossover in that space, but I think seeing that as like they're growing together and recognizing there's stuff that still needs to be done in modern content management that, it's got to be done by somebody.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, I guess. I never thought of that, but wouldn't that eventually make everyone similar though in terms of feature set? Like all I see is people spending time on trinkets, like, hey, we're going to use AI to do this, we're going to use XYZ to do that. Who's actually spending time on the actual strategy? Here's how I'm going to make sure that you have the proper content strategy. Here's how I'm going to make sure you audit it the right way, it gets archived the right way. Like, is there someone...
Well, that's a harder... That's just work.
I think this is kind of one of the fundamental issues, and all of us on this call, I think, are old enough that we've been through this, and we sort of shake our heads at kind of the lack of maturity within a lot of enterprises. Like, we're still solving the exact same problems, and there's still the same questions around auditing and archiving and governance and who's doing these things. And like, yes, the tools have gotten a little bit better, but ultimately a tool can't solve those fundamental things for you. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And I think this is what we're all kind of shaking our heads at a little bit, certainly myself on the vendor side. And even to piggyback off Greg's point, like, even though I made the statement, headless CMSs make you think more about the content structure up front. He's right. Organizations do work really hard to fight against the metaphors of the underlying system and do some silly things because they don't know better. And I think that's I think one of the ongoing frustrations / opportunities. I mean, we're all still employed within this because we're solving these problems, but at some sense, it would be nicer to see some more maturity of just content management as a practice and understanding going forward.
I think it's important to note that a lot of the energy behind these tools was driven by organizations that had a very clear picture of what they wanted to do and weren't able to do it with traditional tools, and drove the development and maturing of like the headless stack. And the challenge is that as it now reaches a point of popularity where more organizations are considering it, they may not have that clear, crisp vision of, oh, we want to break things up this way, consolidate them in this way. Not everybody is in a position to reinvent localization from first principles. They may need to just inherit a workable approach from a CMS vendor and roll with that. And I think that knowledge that power and flexibility means having to take on more of those philosophical questions of how ought we approach governance, localization, all of these things. I think that's the rude awakening that a lot of customers that we've worked with that just dove in thinking, headless, that means faster and better. That's what ends up biting them.
I'm just going to have a different perspective on this here. And that is, I think there's a lot of rationalization that happens when people talk about the lack of maturity in organizations, that they can't take advantage of things because they're missing the maturity. And I think we all are familiar with the concept of a product and market fit, and we will sort of say that, the market isn't ready for this yet because they're not mature enough. But really, I think that's often the product's fault. We haven't really pushed the product enough to help solve these issues like governance. And we'll all acknowledge governance is like a big issue to solve. And I'm not saying that, you can automatically solve it with a tool, but there's a lot more tools could do to help with governance, really. I mean, we're not even scratching the surface. And I don't see vendors spending a lot of effort trying to solve that. And if we want to make this content that people are producing and make it work harder and be able to do more things, we're going to have to help with governance and help people understand what all that content is and how you tag it, and so you make sense of it and see what the performance of it is. And these are all gaps I see in the market. The things that vendors could solve, but they're not putting their effort into it. I mean, right now it's kind of, they're chasing the shiny objects of, whatever sort of AI trinkets can be added on to their existing capabilities without really adding serious capabilities to help solve these core customer problems and elevate the customer's maturity. Vendors can help elevate customer maturity if they really put their heart into it. And so that's my feeling on that.
To go on
go ahead.
To go on your point, I do believe that there's a sort of a trend or a cycle that will happen again. A couple of years ago, we were all on traditional CMSs, no functionality to add on to it, whatsoever. Then we all started pushing DXPs, because if you want to do an omni-channel experience, you need to have a DXP, right? Go figure, even in a DXP, all your content is still siloed, right? There's an email app within a DXP that contains specific data, which is not approachable on a page builder, and so on. So what's the next best thing we want? Headless. Why? Because then there's content without any visual presentation, which you can use anywhere. And that new kind of freedom kind of escalates in going way off board into extreme functionalities. And I believe that we will eventually kind of creep back to the middle to a kind of technology that will be useful for the masses.
I mean, I see a lot of this as being kind of market driven. And while I agree very much with Michael that the tool vendors could do a lot more with, with governance, with authoring experience, certainly with a lot of the different aspects of the CMS to help make them more usable and to help advance the organizational maturity, the organizations have to want to get there. Like they're not going to change the way that they are functionally organized, that they hire and staff, that their processes and stuff like that, unless they see the value. And in most cases that we're seeing, they need to see that value quickly. And that's not something that's going to happen, and no tool can force that change. And I think that's really a problem that I see, because nobody's asking for that stuff. Like, we're not getting RFPs with people asking us to, redefine the way that they approach content at their organizations. And I wish we did. I would love to do that work, but we're just not. And I can't blame any CMS vendor, especially those that are venture funded and have to, report back to their shareholders, for going after what the market is asking of them. And, it's tough to watch. It's tough for all of us as we work with clients that, are making things much harder for themselves than they can. But I just feel like, the tools can only go so far at the end of the day. And that's hard.
I would just say, though, that it's interesting to me that I think content management is about the only internal area of enterprise business operations that hasn't been touched by business process automation or big data or all these things that have been going on in enterprises for the past decade to sort of change how things are done. And content management is the sleepy area. And people still don't understand it very well. So they just come up with basically an RFP list of features that they expect. These RFPs are often kind of pre-written by vendors, and it's just sort of a self-reinforcing cycle that people are asking for things that vendors say they have, and no one is kind of pushing this further. So I understand that the market demand doesn't seem to be explicitly there, but I do think when you look at what's happening in other areas of enterprise modernization, there has to be a desire for that. I imagine, Jeff, you hear people complaining about just how sluggish, content operations are, and so I would think there's going to be someone can solve this.
Yep, we've seen it.
You're on mute, Jeff, if you're speaking. Sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead, Rolf.
Thank you. I was going to say that one of the challenges that we've seen is that in a lot of organizations, the barriers to solving these things at like an org-wide operations level, one of the biggest challenges is that there aren't actually roles in most organizations that are empowered to actually deal with these kinds of cross-silo situations. And when there are roles that are empowered to make those, we're going to change how we think of our content, it's a fundamental asset that we manage and treat in this way now, or something like that. When there are roles with the authority to do that, they may not be in the weeds enough to recognize the kinds of like, oh, hey, the fact that we went out and got a visual page builder 5 years ago and started doing most of our production with that has put us in a position now where we can't do X and Y and Z. At the level of the person who has the authority to actually make the institutional decisions, those in the weeds distinctions of where the problems are actually at are like 2 or 3 levels down. So I think part of it is at the practitioner level, starting to understand the broader, starting to become more comfortable speaking to the broader business context in which these problems are occurring for organizations, not just treating it as like a philosophical issue of better content, but like, okay, at the CMO level, what are you seeing that is the result of this problem? Downstream, what does it actually turn into? I think that kind of stuff is what our practice hasn't yet really internalized. And I think that's the big gap for that operationalization and business process stuff, where it's how you pack stuff into a truck for shipping is an in the weeds question. But when an organization starts to say, oh, but that absolutely controls how quickly and how efficiently we can move our product around, that's when it starts rolling up to the high level decision maker concern. I don't know if that makes sense, but
that's a really good analogy. It makes me think of when UPS went into they'll only make right turns.
Yeah.
And I just think about what made that decision, and because of it affects cost and the amount of money saved and goes back to the shareholders, it was a bigger impact, I would imagine. Roel, did you have anything you wanted to say? Sorry.
Yeah, but I fully agree with what Jeff just said. We've seen it time and time again that the decision is made to buy either vendor A, B, or C from a boardroom level, just because they're able to place a check behind it's easy to use, and that's enough. And then during or after implementation, content editors need to start working with it, and it's a complete problem, to put it nicely. So, and it happens all the time. The place where the decision is made in the board, they have a lack of understanding or maybe even sympathy towards what does it actually mean for my co-workers working with this new technology. They only want to be able to say, well, they can check the box because they said it was easy to use, and that's it. And they're part of keeping this problem alive.
I mean, the interesting thing about Eaton's analogy about the shipping company is that at a high level, someone at the shipping company understands the business of what they're doing, and that enables them to make decisions about how best to change their business to make better money. And I think a lot of the organizations that we are working with, we don't see that. There's nobody who really understands content management or content at a conceptual level, at its position of value at the agency, in the ways that don't have a very, a marketing grand vision around how they want to message things in different places. And so these decisions are made basically by vendors giving good pitches. And that's not a great way to run a circus.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off that. I think the clients that I've seen, at least, that have the most maturity around that, the content is much closer to their core business. Mm-hmm. Like it's either a differentiator or content is essentially their product in one way or the other. They tend to have a very good understanding of that. For anybody else, especially those that are using it purely for marketing, they see it as a marketing function, and they see things in terms of pages, particularly landing pages, and that's sort of their surface level understanding. And I think in a sense that's fair, right? Like if they have a billion other tasks in marketing, and that's one of those 10 that gets 1/10 of their attention. So I think in that way, I agree, a bit with Michael, like, yes, there's more that we could do as vendors to be, meeting that. At the same time, one of the things that I struggle with as a vendor, and I always have for a long time, is this idea of governance, and maybe it needs a rebrand, because I think the moment we say governance, everybody's like eyes glaze over. But in fact, like getting good governance within your CMS really is the core of making it work properly. Like, and we call it governance, and people think bureaucracy and boring and structure, and when in fact it's like this is what you need to do to get the efficiency out of this thing. So perhaps we try to come up with a better name for it, because it does feel like selling broccoli in a lot of ways.
One of the things that I've seen a lot is, and I think, Mark, you touched on this, that a lot of organizations don't necessarily see the value of content as this sort of fundamental business asset if it's not really, really close to their core business. It's not something they're already thinking of in that way. One of the things that we've seen is that a lot of organizations approach content as essentially an ephemeral output. It's an artifact of their marketing efforts. And the challenge is that the stuff that Headless and like a lot of our practices around, planning structures and processes and systems to make these manageable and reproducible, but that work is an investment with the assumption that you're going to be doing it over and over and over, and that you want the thing that you produce to stick around and be of high value. And the more ephemeral and the less enduring any particular content artifact is expected to be, the less perceived payoff there is in that upfront work. And the more you see people saying, okay, Headless sounds good, but just make it work like WordPress. Just make it. Let us just put some pages out there, and we'll figure out what needs to be on them as we. That's a problem for Monday. And I think it's useful to recognize that there are situations where just highly variable, highly ephemeral content is going to be produced, that the stakes are very low if somebody just dumps some HTML into a field and puts it somewhere. But recognizing when there is value to that investment in production being amortized over a longer term for an organization, and thinking that through, like, that distinction, I think, is what isn't necessarily apparent to a lot of the teams doing production, because they are judged on what they output, what numbers are coming in. The teams that are doing production with the CMS tools aren't necessarily incentivized to put the time and energy up front into structuring stuff that's reusable and flexible either.
Yeah, to that point, I think the focus is more on SEO and how many leads you get out of it rather than the quality of the content you produce, unless, like Mark said, if content is your business. So makes absolute sense. So the next one's interesting. I really am curious to see your take on it. Does it make a difference if you choose Headless or traditional on how you approach your content strategy or UX? Or is the end result the same?
This was not the question anybody expected to have a moment of silence. I think Mark's point is a good one, that Headless, for better or worse, forces questions to be addressed. You can't simply inherit all of the pre-made decisions of a full stack CMS and with a traditional vendor and just sort of slipstream into the 20 years of decisions that they've already been making. So you have to make some choices. That doesn't necessarily mean an organization is going to take the time to make good choices.
I think at the same time, then you also don't get the benefit of the out of the box experience that you get with many traditional CMSs. Like, I would argue anyways that the default out of the box authoring experience for many headless vendors leaves a lot to be desired. And I think that, I've talked with some of those vendors and they say, well, we prefer to leave it light and then let the developers figure it out. And that's great if the developers actually figure it out. And, that's not something that often happens. And so I think I think there's a lot less difference than either set of vendors would like us to believe. Like at the end of the day, you still got to understand your business and the goals and priorities of your business, and you've got to understand what you're trying to do with your CMS, and you've got to understand also the technical considerations, like if you've got developers that would rather do X or Y, or if you've got infrastructure that supports, all of these kinds of things, there's a lot of decisions to get made. And many of those decisions are completely this, and at least the information you have to gather to make a decision is the same, regardless of which stack you're ending up with. And I just don't see a lot of differences. And every day that goes on, those differences are less and less from the content strategy and user experience standpoint anyways.
All right, I'm going to again maybe have a slightly different perspective on this. So I think one of the key problems that organizations face when it comes to content is that they aren't able to easily adapt to changing situations. I mean, Jeff has repeated many times about, your strategy never survives first contact with reality or something. So you're constantly remaking your strategy, but we live in a world where we configure a CMS and all the associated functionality to fit a strategy in a particular point in time. And if we buy a complete solution that's already pre-configured for us, it's a great out-of-the-box experience on day one, and then a year from later is starting to fit less what we want to do, and over time it becomes harder and harder to adapt our setup to where we want to be going. And I think in principle, at least, the appeal of Headless is that it can kind of evolve with you, assuming you have all the bits and pieces in place that let you do that. And I know that's a big assumption, but you have the ability to change things, add things. It can grow with you, it can pivot with you, all those kinds of things. And so one of the, again, pain points of big enterprises especially is coordination. This is why no one cared about reusing content for the sake of reusing content, but the value of it is that it's, in principle, it should be easier to coordinate between different parts of your organization if you can share that content. I like talking more about sharing content than reusing content, because that's really where a lot of pain points is, that different teams need to be able to share things. And so ultimately, I think a headless approach can maybe make your content strategy think in a broader sense, in a longer term sense.
Yeah, I'm curious actually if you guys notice the same thing. So in my mind, when I talk to the people who are working on traditional CMS implementations, typically when you talk about content models or data models, it's developers. But what's interesting is on the composable end for a headless CMS implementation, you see a lot more non-technical people talk about content structure, content modeling. They're even taking like online courses for the vendor to be more proficient of what's a good content model, right? Do you guys notice that as well?
Yeah.
I mean, I've noticed it for sure. I think, but I don't know how much of that has to do with the tools themselves. Like I kind of, and I admit this is a little pet peeve of mine, but I kind of bristle at this equivalency of composable with headless, because a lot of the principles of composable you can do with many traditional CMSs. I look at what we do with Drupal, and we are swapping out digital asset management systems all the time, login systems all the time. We've done headless Drupal implementations with various front ends. It's like a lot of the stuff that the marketing departments at headless vendors have defined as composable is really, to me, just a way for them to come up with a new word to sell something that is very possible in many other places and to distinguish themselves. That's not 100% true, but maybe it's 80% true. But I kind of lost my train of thought there now. Sorry. I had to get my...
All I know is that I said something which ticked you off, Greg.
Yeah, I know it didn't tick me off. I just had to get it out there. But I think that I don't remember what you were talking about now. So
No,
forgive me,
in the
please.
sense that from a more headless implementations, it seems like non-developers are taking on the.
Oh, right.
It's-
I think what's happening is the vendors are seeing that as value on the headless side, and so they're putting that content out there. And I haven't seen a lot of that at least in my world, I haven't seen a lot of that being pushed in the marketing at Acquia or from the Drupal Association or whatever. That's not something that they're centered on, which I think is a shame, because I think the content modeling tools in Drupal are on par with any of the other headless products. But I see it with our clients. I see it within my company, because we've made it part of our culture that content modeling and content strategy is at the center of all of our projects. And then we spread that to our clients. And so I don't think, again, it has as much to do with the technology as how the technology is being sold by the people who are trying to distinguish themselves and see what their value is.
Also, I think it's useful to keep in mind that headless CMSs put the content model in the forefront. Like,
Right.
by definition, in every one of these headless tools, you are manipulating the content model. There's no intermediary layer for you to engage with that has the content model behind the scenes to store stuff. You're working with it directly. So I think a larger pool of people, headless tools, by nature, by virtue of the fact that that's how they conceptualize tasks and workflows, it has put that concern into like the field of vision of a lot of people in like marketing and production that wouldn't otherwise have thought about it by that name.
I think it's in some cases almost by accident, though, ironically, because I think, yes, that's absolutely true that it's more at the forefront, and you're doing that in a web-based user interface, and it's beautiful and colorful and easy to pick fields and all of that sort of stuff. But at the same time, a lot of CMSs still lump that documentation under like developer tasks, and still sort of focus on like the CI/CD pipeline of making sure that content modeling is synced to your code repository and is pushed along with your code and all that sort of stuff. And so I think it's interesting. I absolutely think that content modeling should be a business task and not not a developer sort of led function. Those folks who are closer to the domain understanding of what that content is trying to accomplish tend to be more businessy than developer-y. I think it is funny that it's kind of a little schizophrenic. I do really think that and I'm seeing some things like comment from Paula, no CMS traditional vendor talked about content models. Like, yes and no. Like, Drupal did, Sitecore did, but it was always very much a developer-y understanding. And I think that has kind of continued over to headless CMSs, even though they have done a much better job with the UX of it. So practitioners who are on the business side have kind of started picking it up and understanding that way. I think headless vendors should lean into that more, for sure. I would like to see more of that.
I've used the map analogy a lot, where like a content model is sort of like a map, and its use is in coordinating people primarily. Like the value of a content model in an organization is getting the developers and the designers and the production people and the business people on the same page about what they're talking about when they need to coordinate about these things. And the challenge is that there's no one complete perfect map that 100% captures every aspect of what's going on with the content. It's sort of like there's a satellite map, there's a map of the subways of the city, there's a novelty map of all the best sandwich shops in the city. All of those are true, but they're talking about specific things. And I think one of the challenges is that a lot of content modeling has historically been about data storage, about planning what bits of data get stored how and where. so that we can actually go and build this thing. And that's very close, just like, the highway map is not wrong for, for the decisions it makes. But I think as more different roles get involved in that, I think it's becoming more apparent to organizations that like there's a lot of different aspects that sort of live on the big model that aren't necessarily about data storage or things like that. And I think that's also where more headless vendors are starting to get into deep waters, that a very, very good layer for doing content as data and delivery and management and stuff like that. Once that's done, there's that whole expansive world of, coordination around it that's a new, fresh challenge to tackle.
I'm going to say that I do see sort of growing interest among content folks in content modeling, but there is a gap in terms of the tools. So the tools still are very developer focused. I mean, most CMSs, whatever kind of CMS we're talking about, don't make it easy for a non-technical person to get directly involved in the content modeling. And that needs to change. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the industry overall, no code and low code is where the momentum is. People want to feel empowered, and they don't want this artificial separation between they as a user and what they can define themselves, they want the tool to do for them. And I hate to use the governance word again, but I mean, there needs to be ways of giving people access to content models where they can make modifications, add a field, do things like that. But also have built-in versioning and, maybe putting some roles and permissions around what different folks can do, where you can empower people to make some changes, but you're not going to blow things up either. And right now we don't have that kind of thing. So it seems like it's this scary divide between, the guardians and the technical side and the people who are curious about what's there and is this really working on my behalf, and they're not really able to do things yet.
But even that's tricky to try to push, because it's like, as a vendor, hey, we've introduced this extra level of abstraction that you now need to think about between, developers and users and the content model and the governance and all those sorts of things. And a lot of people are just like, oh man, that's too complex for me, even though, again, it would be solving more of their problem if they take a second to think it through and then understand what that level of abstraction is achieving, and then how to get to it, and what it accomplishes and what it gives for them. So to me, it underscores that struggle between building stuff that, as a vendor, that are good but really hard to communicate the value of, especially if it's additional work and understanding that people need to know upfront.
Yeah, that's to me the biggest problem I have with content modeling and clients is getting them to get it at a conceptual level, to step back and understand it. It's like, how do we, and we've gone through so many ways to try to communicate content models and what they mean and what their implications are to clients and business owners. And that's where I would love to see more thought work done, is like, how can we get those people to understand what a content model is and what it means and why it's important and how it impacts things, and how to put the pieces together, and what it means to have, and some of that is very broad and some of it's very specific, like what's the difference between a multi-instance field versus a single instance field, and how does that impact the way that you're going to use that content going forward. And there's a great big gap to bridge there, and I think we all agree on that probably.
And I think this comes back to that issue of what level does each different team member need to think about that?
Mm-hmm.
Like at one level, where exactly the different valves for all of the, plumbing and, sewer structure for the city, that matters a lot. For other people, no, I just need to know that this neighborhood, I just need to take this road. It's sort of like, some people need to think about institutional ontology. Some people just need to know, no, title is a required field for a press release, and figuring out how to neither one is correct, but different people are going to need to engage with that at different levels, and I think that's a challenge. I also see someone in chat asked about LLMs, so the
Oh boy.
punch your ticket. The LLM question came in.
Yeah, I wish we could go through more questions, but I'm going to throw a little bit of fuel into the fire anyways. But it's interesting, right? So I'm going to piggyback off of all of you guys, which is the headless world is doing a better job messaging and getting to the non-technical users for content modeling. I also think educating is super important. And to Michael's point, if you go into the UI of any of these tools, they're very developer focused. And to Jeff's point and to LLMs, maybe a content author just needs to say, you know what, I want a title, I want a description, I want an author, but I want the author picked from the list of authors I specified. And somehow it either does the content modeling, or a developer can pick that up and say, okay, I know this is a linked field which links to authors kind of thing. But there's a huge disservice there. And I think from a traditional CMSs, at least the ones I'm involved in, the documentation is very developer focused, and non-developer would not have a clue of what they're doing in the interface or the documentation. That's my 2 cents on that. But Jeff, did you have anything specific with the AI question that came through in terms of?
I think a couple of folks have already even been discussing it in the comments. I think that using LLMs and generative AI to figure out answers to fundamental structural questions and fundamental organizational questions is incredibly dangerous, because they're pattern following tools, and they're very, very good at that, and they're capable of amazing things, but they cannot tell you what ought to be. They can only tell you what has been commonly done, and that doesn't necessarily give you insight into what's going on or what you're trying to accomplish. And if that's what's hazy, no AI is going to help that.
Yeah, I mean, the simplest example of that is like author on a content model. Like, okay, well, if this is a press release, you probably just have one author. If this is an academic paper, you most certainly have more than one author. And so should that field support selecting a single reference to author? Should that field be a rich text field that you're just putting in names? Should that field be multi-select to pick multiple authors? The answer is going to be 100% different. So there's no LLM, and unless it gets smart enough to really understand the underlying context of the problem that you're trying to solve, that's going to answer that accurately.
Yeah, but isn't that also a partner's responsibility? It's a vendor's responsibility to give you the tools you need to take that concept and use it the way it fits your company best. But we see a lot of headless projects done by partners that don't really grasp the concept of content modeling themselves, and therefore create a huge problem to be discovered in the future. And that's something that needs attention on like yesterday. Because a lot of us out there just don't have a clue on how to advise their clients on their specific use case in order to make headless work for them as it should. And that's a real issue.
And it's not just for headless either.
True. Yeah, true.
Yep.
True.
All right.
We've also seen partners or clients that are on a headless project come to us in tears because they just don't know how to use their own product. They're basically saying, where's my page builder? My content editors are running out the door because they can't use our new system. And we don't understand, because all we wanted was to go headless, and now we're headless, and there's no page builder. What happened? So there's a lot of growing up for all of us. Managing clients' expectations is a big one, but also getting the partner landscape up to par with the concept of content modeling and how to use it in each specific use case for clients.
All right. Thanks, Earl. Thank you so much, guys. I'm trying to keep on time because we all have things we want to jump to. I want to give a shout out to Greg again. If you can help support his effort, I believe some of us or some of the people on this call are probably quoted or love the book coming out and the things it does have. So please support Greg if you can. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you guys really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Too
Thank you.
short as always.
Yeah.
True.